All right, what we're going to be looking at in this lesson is we're going to be looking at the idea of political institutions and kind of what political institutions exist and how they interact with the government. All right, political institutions are structures of a political system that carry out the work of governing. Just because countries have the same types of institutions does not mean that those institutions have the same power. So when we think about parties, say in the United States or the UK, it is not going to mean the same thing when we talk about party in China, because it is going to be a very, very different concept. All right, so let's look at different levels of government, because we need to understand this in order to understand kind of how these political institutions exist. The first type we have here is a unitary government. A unitary government is one that concentrates all policy-making powers in one central geographic place. So if we look at France and we look at the UK, and there's other countries that are like this as well, there is no distinction between different areas. So, for example, say here, just here alone, living in Oviedo, you can deal with Oviedo Police, you can deal with Seminole County Police, you can deal with Florida Highway Patrol. So there's different levels right there of different types of government. And then you can have the FBI and the CIA come down or something like that from the federal level. All right, so we've got all sorts of different levels of government. We've got local, we've got state, we've got federal. All things that have to be dealt with. If we go to France, there's only the French police. There is no different levels. Towns don't have their own police. It only has that one level, and that's going to be different in each country as to why they do that based upon different historical implications. All right. You can also have a confederal system. A confederal system spreads the power among many subunits and has a really weak central government. And really most of the time that central government has very little to no say over what actually goes on within each of those subunits. If you look at the United States when it first starts, after, during the Revolution and shortly thereafter the Revolution, we were a confederacy in which every single state still retained their own independent sovereignty. They still had the ability to make their own decisions and things like that, and they shared a really weak central government. You could also have a federal system. A federal system divides the power between the central government and regional bodies that have significant power, such as taxation, lawmaking, and keeping order, which is the system that we have currently in the United States. We're also going to see that type of system in Mexico as well, in which you have a strong central government that has the ability to make lots of different decisions and things like that. However, there's also the ability to create their own police forces. So that goes back to you having an Oviedo police force and a Seminole County police force and things like that. Another type of organization that can exist outside of the country is known as the supranational organization. And supranational organizations are not bound by national boundaries. These organizations reflect a trend towards integration, in which you have multiple countries that work together in order to kind of do their own thing. A process that encourages states to pool their sovereignty in order to gain political, economic, and social clout. Examples of these are NATO. So we've got NATO, we've got our different countries that are part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that agree to provide mutual defense to each other. And that's a really good deterrent. So when you've got 20 or so countries that are willing to fight with each other if they're attacked, it's going to really make somebody think twice before they decide to do that. The EU, which is the European Union, which is something that we're going to be talking about later on in a different unit. We've got NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that is an agreement that allows for all countries within North America, especially Mexico, the United States, and Canada to be able to freely trade with each other. And then you've got OPEC, which is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. And OPEC is largely responsible for a lot of the oil that goes throughout the world, and they have a huge impact on what oil prices are. All right. These organizations reflect the concept of globalization, which is the integration of social, environmental, economic, and cultural activities of nations. And when you look at it, we have become a much smaller world. It is very easy to get information from one place to another. If we go back, 150 years, maybe 200 years, it could take months in order for information to go from one country to another, especially if you had to cross an ocean. But today, we're able to transmit information much quicker. I can send information around the world with a simple click of a button, or I can talk to somebody on the opposite side of the world face to face through using technologies like Skype and things like that. So we really need to be mindful about the types of ways in which we interact, because our economies are so much more intertwined with each other, and what happens in one country can negatively affect what happens in another. All right, so we've got challenges to the nation state. So with these supranational organizations carrying so much weight, it starts to pull away some of the sovereignty that exists in these independent nation states. In the EU, member states are subject to the rules and laws of the EU, which reduces their sovereignty. So there's a huge impact that goes along with these things. So we're starting to see a changing concept as to what maybe nationhood is, and its role within geopolitics. All right, another concept that we have to look at here is centripetal versus centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces tend to unify nations, while centrifugal forces tend to fragment them. So centripetal forces bind together the people of a state, giving them strength. One of the most powerful centripetal forces is nationalism, or the ability to identify oneself based upon nationhood. So if we are able to create these unifying concepts, that's what we would refer to as a centripetal force. A centrifugal force is something that would destabilize the government and encourage the country to fall apart. These tend to take hold in countries that are not well organized or that are not well governed. Separatist movements tend to take place in which groups who self-identify as being separate from the government fight for independence. And we're largely seeing that right now, say with the Russians who live in the Ukraine, who are trying to pull themselves apart from the Ukrainian government and attach themselves to Russia, which has caused a lot of conflict. And that's definitely something that we'll be talking about quite a bit this year. So when we continue to think about this idea of centrifugal forces, there are some different things that we can think of here. One is this idea of devolution, and this is the tendency to decentralize decision-making to regional governments. So this takes a lot of power away from that central concept. And when you start to take a lot of power away from that central government and provide it to these outer level concepts, it really makes people lose confidence in that central idea, and really puts them out on their own island, which can really tear apart the structure of what's going on within that government. So that's definitely a centrifugal force. We can also look at the idea of ethnic force. An ethnic group shares a well-developed sense of belonging to the same culture. So this identity is based upon language, religion, custom, tradition, history, things like that. So when we look at the idea of ethno-nationalism and how this contributes to the idea of a centrifugal force, this is the tendency for an ethnic group to see itself as a distinct nation with a right to autonomy or independence. So the Chechens within Russia. We see this with the separation of Sudan into North Sudan and South Sudan. So when we look at these concepts of this ethno concept, when they want to separate themselves from the place that they're at and create their own nation, then that's a centrifugal force because it's pulling away from the power of the central government. We also have the idea of economic forces and spatial forces. Economic inequalities can destabilize a nation state, particularly if the inequalities are regional. So if you've got one part of the country that's way richer than the other part of the country, then they're going to feel this huge tension, which goes back to the cleavages that we talked about before. And that could definitely is a centrifugal force and could definitely cause a lot of conflict within the country. We can also have spatial forces, and this is the distance and remoteness of a country. So if you're kind of far away from where the central part of the government is, and you're separated by a desert, you're separated by water, you're separated by mountains, that's going to cause a lot of distinct issues. And we see that, say, like in China, where we've got some outskirt areas, and we'll talk about that more when we get to China. So there's some outskirt parts of China that are very separate from what's going on in the rest of the country, and they have a very different ethnic kind of build up. They've got very different perspectives on what's going on with the government, and a lot of that is promoted by how kind of distant they are from the rest of the society. All right, so going back, and this kind of pulls us back to what we talked about a little bit in the last unit when we talked a little bit about interest groups. And we're kind of define this in a little bit of a different way, is through the idea of linkage institutions. All right, linkage institutions are organizations that are intermediaries between the people and the government. So an interest group, or sorry, a linkage institution is trying to connect people with what's going on in the government. And really the three organizations that we look at when we look at linkage institutions are political parties, interest groups, and the media. So political parties obviously trying to get people elected into office, interest groups trying to push certain social concepts, and then the media is a big part of disseminating the information of what's going on in the government to the people. When we look at media, we're not just talking about major sources of media like television and newspapers anymore. We're talking about the internet. We're talking about Twitter. We're talking about Facebook. We're talking about these different tools that people have to be able to interact with each other, because these are becoming bigger and bigger components of what's going on throughout our world. All right. Political parties operate in countries and have varying roles depending on the system of the country. Generally, though, when we look at political parties, we see them help bring different people and ideas together to establish the means by which the majority can rule, to provide labels for candidates that help citizens vote, because when you get a label, whether right or wrong, it's going to tell you a lot about who that candidate is and who they stand for. And if that party is a consistent concept, then without maybe even looking at the candidate, you can know a little bit about who they are based upon the party that they're part of, which can be a very negative thing as well. And then it can also hold politicians accountable to the electorate, because you know who you're supporting and you know what group you're supporting. All right. So once again, interest groups, which we talked about quite a bit before, but it's a good thing to drive home here, is interest groups are organizations of like-minded people whose main political goal is to influence and shape public policy. So parties and interest groups are different because parties run candidates for office, while interest groups only support candidates. And parties have a broad spectrum of interest, while once again, interest groups generally only focus on one thing, maybe two things. Interest groups in authoritarian regimes are sometimes referred to as transmission belts, meaning that they convey the desires of the party elite to the people. So rather than where in a democratic society where the interest groups are supposed to communicate what the people want to the government, in a authoritarian regime it works in the opposite way, and it drives what the state's message is to the people. All right. In the West, interest groups are autonomous, meaning that they do not work concurrently with the government. They are independent of the government, and they make their own kind of statements as to what they want to see happen. In between two systems, you've got corporatism. Corporatism is when the government approves a group's monopoly of a certain sector of the economy. All right, so state corporatism is where the state determines which groups are brought in. And societal corporatism, or neo-corporatism, is where the interest groups take the lead and dominate the state. So we're going to see varying degrees of each of these concepts as we move through.